I came home expecting nothing more exciting than unloading groceries and mowing the strip of grass along my driveway before the weekend. But instead I found a heavy steel chain stretched across the only road leading to my house, a brand new padlock hanging from it like a trophy, and a man I'd barely known for 3 months standing on the other side recording me with his phone as if I were the one committing a crime. "Go ahead," he called out with the kind of grin that only comes from someone convinced they've already won. Smile for the camera. For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd taken a wrong turn because nothing about what I was seeing made any sense. Then I recognized the cedar post. I'd paid to install that gate almost a decade earlier after a logging truck clipped the old one, and now someone had poured fresh concrete around a new support post, wrapped it with chain twice, installed a different keypad, and somehow decided my own road no longer belonged to me. I punched in the access code I'd been using for years, but the keypad flashed red and beeped twice. My neighbor folded his arms across his chest. "Doesn't work anymore," he said. "We upgraded security." His wife stepped out onto their porch carrying a glass of white wine even though it wasn't much past lunchtime, leaning against the railing like she was watching a neighborhood parade. "Honestly," she laughed, "the whole entrance looks so much nicer now. You should thank us. It's helping everybody's property values." I looked down at the concrete, still damp enough to leave fingerprints if I'd touched it. I looked at the chain, the blinking security camera mounted above the keypad, and finally back at the two people smiling at me like this had all been carefully rehearsed. "I need to get home," I said quietly. "Then take the county road around back," the husband answered without missing a beat. "That's your option now." I almost laughed because the county road flooded every time we had 2 decent days of rain, and we'd had nearly a week of storms. "That road's underwater." He shrugged. "Then maybe buy a truck that floats." His wife added, "Most people wouldn't make such a big deal over something like this." Then she paused just long enough to make sure I heard the next part. "People like you usually don't." Now, I wish I could tell you I came back with some clever one-liner or cut the chain with bolt cutters right there in front of them, but I didn't. Maybe 10 years earlier I would have. Age teaches you strange things, one of them being that the loudest victory usually belongs to whoever loses control first. So I smiled, looked directly into his phone camera, and said, "Keep recording. You're going to want this video later." Then I backed my truck around, drove through 3 miles of muddy water that nearly reached the bottom of my doors, and headed straight for the county recorder's office. Here's something most people never realize until they own rural property. Just because a road crosses someone's land doesn't automatically mean they can block it. Years before either of us bought those parcels, the original family farm had been divided into smaller lots. My house ended up tucked behind what was now my neighbor's property, and because of that, the deeds included a permanent recorded access easement. It wasn't some handshake agreement or an old story people told over coffee. It was recorded with the county, tied to both properties forever unless a judge ordered otherwise. His land carried the burden. Mine carried the legal right to use that road. I sat in the records office flipping through scanned documents until I found the original subdivision paperwork. The language wasn't dramatic. Legal documents rarely are. It simply stated that the access route must remain open and unobstructed for the benefit of the rear parcel, and that no gate, lock, fence, or physical barrier could be installed without written consent from both property owners. There it was, tucked halfway down the second page in plain black letters. Funny thing about the truth, sometimes it isn't hidden at all. Sometimes people just never bother reading far enough to find it. I asked the clerk to print certified copies of every relevant document, thanked her, and drove home by the flooded road again. The chain was still there. The camera was still blinking. My neighbors were gone now, probably celebrating what they thought was their victory. I didn't knock on their door. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't argue across the fence. Instead, the very next morning, I hired the oldest licensed surveyor in the county, a gray-haired man named Walter, who had spent 40 years settling arguments exactly like this one. He showed up carrying orange paint, a weathered clipboard, and the calm expression of someone who'd already seen every possible version of human stupidity. As he began measuring the easement, I stood back and watched while my neighbor stormed outside demanding to know what was happening. Walter never even looked up. He simply continued walking, checked another measurement, and sprayed one bright orange mark directly onto the fresh concrete around the new post. Then another across the bottom rail of the gate. Then, Without hesitation, he stepped 6 feet into their beautifully landscaped flower bed and painted one more line across the decorative stone border. "Hey," my neighbor shouted. "You can't paint my yard." Walter finally stopped writing, looked at him over his glasses, and said in the calmest voice I'd heard all week, "Past this orange line. It isn't entirely your yard." For the first time since this whole mess started, the smile disappeared from my neighbor's face, and standing there watching him suddenly realize this story wasn't going to end the way he'd imagined. I had a feeling the real fight hadn't even begun. Walter packed away his measuring equipment without another word, climbed into his old pickup, and drove off, leaving 3 streaks of orange paint behind that somehow made my neighbor more nervous than any shouting match ever could. I stood there for another minute before heading home, and I could practically feel his eyes burning into the back of my jacket. Funny how confidence changes shape. 24 hours earlier, he had been standing behind a locked gate acting like he owned the world. Now he couldn't stop staring at 3 little marks on the ground. I spent the rest of that afternoon making copies of every document Walter needed for his final survey, then called an attorney I'd used years before when a utility company accidentally crossed one corner of my property. His name was Graham Ellis, the kind of lawyer who never raised his voice because he never had to. I dropped the survey notes, the certified easement records, old maintenance receipts for the gate, and nearly a decade's worth of invoices for gravel deliveries onto his conference table. He thumbed through everything quietly before looking at me over the top of his reading glasses. "Did you ever ask them for maintenance reimbursement?" he asked. I laughed. "Never crossed my mind." "Well," he replied with the smallest grin, "it probably should have crossed theirs." That sentence stayed with me. I'd spent years paying to keep that road in good condition because it served both houses. Every spring, I'd order fresh gravel after the snowmelt carved ruts into the lane. Every fall, I'd trim back branches so delivery trucks could get through. When the keypad failed one winter, I paid the technician because I didn't want either family locked out. My neighbors before these folks had always split costs without argument. We weren't friends exactly, but we respected the arrangement because the paperwork made the responsibilities clear. Then the Collins family moved in. That's what I've decided to call them because the real names don't matter nearly as much as the attitude they brought with them. They had come from a fast-growing suburb where every neighborhood had electronic gates, homeowners committees, and people who seemed to believe money automatically rewrote history. Within weeks, they had replaced fences, torn out old shrubs, and started talking about modernizing the entrance to the properties. Looking back, I remembered little comments I'd brushed aside at the time. Mr. Collins once joked that it was strange another man had to drive across his land every day. His wife had complained that my truck kicked dust onto her flowers during dry summers. At a neighborhood barbecue, she even asked whether I'd ever considered selling my place because, in her words, it would make both properties so much more valuable if one owner controlled the whole entrance. At the time I smiled, changed the subject, and figured they were simply dreaming out loud. Now I realized they'd probably been planning something for months. 2 days later, Graham mailed the certified letter. There was nothing emotional about it. No threats. No dramatic language. Just facts. It cited the recorded easement number, the filing date from decades earlier, the exact paragraph prohibiting obstructions, and the maintenance clause requiring both benefiting parties to share reasonable upkeep expenses based on use. The letter demanded removal of the chain, lock, concrete post, replacement keypad, and surveillance equipment that interfered with lawful access. It also requested reimbursement for 9 years of gate maintenance, gravel replacement, drainage work, and repairs I had paid alone. Reading it almost made me laugh because the total wasn't outrageous. It wasn't about bankrupting anyone. It simply reflected reality. Rights come with responsibilities, and responsibilities don't disappear because someone ignores page 2 of a deed. Less than an hour after the letter arrived, my phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. The moment I answered, Mr. Collins exploded. "You're harassing my family," he yelled. "You send surveyors onto my property, then lawyers? Are you serious?" I waited until he finally paused to breathe. "Did you read the letter?" "I don't need to read garbage." "You should, especially the second page reference." Silence. I could hear papers moving around, drawers opening, more rustling. Finally his voice returned, noticeably quieter. "I don't see what you're talking about." "Then look at your deed." Another long pause followed. "It's not there. Call your title company," I said. "I'll wait." Then I hung up. That might sound cold, but there was no point arguing with someone whose biggest problem wasn't me. It was the paperwork sitting in his own filing cabinet. The following morning, I was drinking coffee on my porch when a white SUV pulled into the Collins driveway. A woman stepped out carrying a leather portfolio with the logo of the title company printed across the front. She spent nearly 2 hours inside their house. Voices drifted through open windows. Once I heard someone slam a door. Later that afternoon, another vehicle arrived, this one belonging to the real estate agent who had represented the sale. She stayed even longer. By sunset, nobody was smiling anymore. The next day, I noticed something else. The security camera above the gate had been turned sideways. It wasn't recording my driveway anymore. Maybe that was coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. Walter returned on Friday with the finalized survey. We walked the easement together while he explained something I hadn't expected. You know, he said, tapping one corner of the map, the chain isn't actually the biggest issue. I frowned. What is? He pointed toward the landscaped entrance. They've been improving the property right over the easement. Decorative retaining stones, irrigation lines, flower beds, electrical conduit for those pathway lights, all inside the protected corridor. I stared at the drawing. Can they do that? They can landscape it, he replied. But only if those improvements don't interfere with access, maintenance, or future utility work. If repairs are ever needed. He shrugged. Everything inside the easement can legally be removed. I looked across the entrance where Mrs. Collins spent nearly every Saturday tending expensive roses she'd proudly imported from a specialty nursery. Thousands of dollars in landscaping sat directly where the easement ran. She didn't even know it. Neither, apparently, did her husband. That evening there was another knock at my door. This time it wasn't either neighbor. It was an older gentleman named Harold Benson, whose family had lived down the road for nearly 50 years. He held an envelope full of faded photographs. Heard you're having trouble with the entrance, he said. We sat on my porch while he spread old pictures across the table. Black and white images showed the original gravel lane back, when it was nothing more than a farm road between hay fields. One photo stopped me cold. There, standing beside the lane, were the original owners shaking hands with county officials during the subdivision approval decades earlier. Harold tapped the picture. That road was never supposed to belong to one person, he said quietly. Old Mr. Whitaker insisted on that before he'd sell any land. Said someday somebody would forget why the easement existed, and when they did, this paperwork would save everyone a whole lot of fighting. I couldn't help smiling. Looks like he was right. Harold chuckled. Most old farmers usually are. Monday morning, the sound of jackhammers echoed through the valley. I stepped outside just in time to watch a contractor break apart the fresh concrete surrounding the new post. Nobody waved. Nobody argued. Workers loaded the broken chunks into a trailer while another crew removed the chain, disconnected the replacement keypad, and unbolted the camera. Mr. Collins never once looked toward my house. His wife stood inside the garage with her arms folded, avoiding eye contact with everyone. By lunchtime, the entrance looked almost exactly as it had before, except for the scar where the new concrete had been cut away. 3 days later, a certified envelope arrived in my mailbox containing a reimbursement check along with a brief note from their attorney confirming compliance with the recorded easement agreement. No apology. No explanation. Just payment. Honestly, I wasn't disappointed. Some people apologize with words. Others apologize with signatures on checks. Either one gets the message across. I thought the story was over. I really did. The road was open again. The legal fight had ended before it ever reached a courtroom. My neighbors stopped making sarcastic comments whenever we passed each other. Life slowly settled back into something that resembled normal. Then Walter called me one more time. I was reviewing the historical survey files, he said. There's something buried beneath that easement that neither title company mentioned. I leaned back in my chair. What did you find? An older recorded easement. Older than both houses. Older than the subdivision itself. Different signatures. Different purpose. I felt that strange little knot form in my stomach again. The same feeling I'd had the day I first saw that chain across my road. Because if Walter sounded surprised after 4 decades of surveying land, whatever he had found wasn't going to be something ordinary. Walter met me at the county archives the following Wednesday, and before he said a single word, he spread an old yellowed survey map across a wooden table that looked almost as old as the document itself. He pointed to a faint line running beneath the modern easement, then traced it with his finger until it disappeared beyond both of our properties. This wasn't created when the subdivision was built, he said. It goes back almost 70 years. The original farm owner had reserved that strip of land as a permanent access and utility corridor long before anyone dreamed of building houses there. Every later deed referenced it in one way or another, but over the years people stopped paying attention because nothing ever happened. Until now. As it turned out, the Collins family had never just blocked my driveway. They had poured concrete, installed electrical wiring, buried irrigation lines, and built landscaping directly over an older protected corridor that utility crews still retained the legal right to access if repairs were ever needed. Walter looked at me and smiled. Ironically, if they had simply left your gate alone, nobody probably would have noticed. Sometimes pride has a funny way of shining a spotlight on problems that had stayed hidden for decades. A month later, that prediction became reality. A regional utility contractor announced routine inspections along several historic easements, including ours. Bright flags appeared along the roadside, followed by paint markings almost identical to Walter's orange lines. I watched from my porch as workers politely explained to the Collins family that portions of their decorative landscaping would have to be removed to guarantee future access. They weren't being punished. They weren't being singled out. The crews were simply enforcing rights that had existed longer than any of us had owned our homes. Mrs. Collins stood quietly beside the flower bed she had spent years perfecting, and for the first time since we'd become neighbors, I honestly felt a little sympathy. Losing expensive landscaping hurts, but it hurts a lot less than losing your integrity. A few days later, while I was replacing a section of split-rail fence near my barn, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and found Mr. Collins standing there without his usual confidence. His hands stayed buried in his pockets for several seconds before he finally spoke. I should have read the paperwork. It wasn't much, but it was probably the most honest sentence I'd heard from him since the day we met. I nodded. Would have saved us both a lot of time. He looked toward the entrance where the old gate now stood exactly where it had always belonged. I thought owning the front parcel meant I controlled everything that crossed it. A lot of people think that, I answered. Property law doesn't always work the way common sense says it should. He gave a quiet laugh, shook his head, and after another awkward pause added, I'm sorry about the road. There it was. Not written by a lawyer. Not attached to a reimbursement check. Just one neighbor finally admitting he had been wrong. I accepted it because holding on to anger would have cost me far more than anything he'd taken. These days we wave when we pass each other. We aren't close friends, and we probably never will be, but we understand something now that wasn't true before. Respect doesn't come from fences, locks, or security cameras. It comes from recognizing that sometimes your rights end exactly where someone else's begin. Every now and then I still drive through that gate and remember the morning I found a chain stretched across my own road. At the time it felt like someone had stolen a piece of my home. Looking back, though, I realized they really handed me something far more valuable. They reminded me that patience beats pride more often than people think, and that the strongest tool you can own isn't a pair of bolt cutters or an expensive attorney. It's knowing the truth before the person standing across from you even realizes there is one. That old road is still there today, quiet as ever, carrying tire tracks instead of arguments. And every time I pass the spot where that concrete post once stood, I can't help smiling because the only thing stronger than the chain they wrapped around my driveway turned out to be the words they'd ignored on page 2 of a deed. So now I want to hear from you. If you had come home and found your own driveway chain shut by a neighbor who honestly believed you were the trespasser, what would you have done first? Would you have cut the lock, called the sheriff, or handled it exactly the way I did? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and I'd really like to hear where you stand. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes the loudest person always wins, because sometimes all it takes to settle the biggest fight is one forgotten page that nobody bothered to read.